In Essential Task 7.4, we are going to take the principles of operant conditioning established in Essential Task 7.3 and add a phenomenon known as schedules of reinforcement. Not only did B.F. Skinner, the key psychologist in Essential Task 7.3, denote the idea that reinforcement and punishment can influence behavior, he also denoted the influence of time. So in Essential Task 7.4, we are going to begin talking about how time relates to, one, the receipt of reinforcement, and two, the extent to which the behaviors that are being reinforced are likely to continue. What you are currently looking at is Essential Task 7.4 and 7.5 under the category of Principles of Operant Conditioning. Today we are only going to talk about the 6 boxes here to the left under Schedules of Reinforcement. So we are not talking about the applications portion over to the right until Essential Task 7.5. I'll return back now to the Essential Task text, allowing you to copy down the portions of the task indicated in yellow. So again, the overall point of Schedules of Reinforcement is to talk about, yes, we have the idea of reinforcement. We have the idea that reinforcement makes behaviors more likely to occur. Those are things that were established over here, whether it's positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. But the other question is, what happens when we vary the frequency? Skinner denoted that you can provide reinforcement essentially based on 2 separate categories. The first is reinforcement based on intervals. In Skinner terminology, the term interval references a measurement of time, specifically an increment of time that you can readily measure on a clock. So if you are rewarded based on carrying out a behavior for a set amount of minutes, hours, weeks, years, months, seconds, you're being rewarded based on an increment of time, which Skinner classified as an interval. For example, I get a paycheck every 2 weeks. Perhaps those of you at home, those of you watching this, get paid every week or every 2 weeks. There is a definitive set in stone increment of time that you can clearly see pass on a clock, days or weeks, that needs to occur before you receive the reinforcement. Those are increments of time. Those are what we call intervals. There are 2 different types of intervals, though. Fixed interval and variable interval, and they have differing overall effects on the specific target behavior. For example, if you utilize what's called a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement, you provide reinforcement to the organism after a definitive set quantity of time has passed, and the organism fully knows how much time needs to pass before the reward, or the reinforcement rather, is provided. The term fixed in Skinner terminology means does not change. As we just alluded to, the term interval in Skinner terminology means a time measurement, an increment of time. When we combine the word fixed with the word interval, we produce the phrase fixed interval, meaning a definitive set in time, fixed, quantity of time that needs to pass before the reinforcement is received. Paychecks are a classic example of fixed interval, but there are other examples. If you tell a student, do work for 20 minutes and then we can do some type of reinforcing behavior. Maybe we can go take a mask break. Maybe we can give the students candy. That's fixed interval. There's a definitive set amount of time that needs to pass, let's say 20 minutes, before the reinforcement is provided. Let's say you're trying to get someday your child to study for an upcoming exam. You tell your child, study for 30 minutes, then you can get rewarded. Maybe at that point, I can reinforce you by letting you use your phone for 10 minutes. You unknowingly might even be using this right now to study. Things like computers and cell phones can be very distracting when studying. Perhaps you've decided, I'm going to take my cell phone, I'm going to put it off to the side, I'm going to study for an hour. Then at the end of that hour, I will reinforce myself by checking my phone. I will use that phone in many ways as a reward system. And then I'll study for another hour and then get a 10-hour break. When you receive a reinforcement after a definitive set quantity of time has passed, you're utilizing what's called a fixed interval. That varies from what's called variable interval. In Skinner terminology, variable means it does in fact change. And of course, interval means a passage of time needs to occur. There are other behaviors that are reinforced with a schedule of reinforcement that we call variable interval. And again, we're going to combine these 2 terms. Variable means it changes, it's kind of random. Interval means a passage of time. Receiving text messages is probably the most tangible example of a variable interval schedule of reinforcement, because at any given moment, randomly out of the blue, just by looking at your phone, you could receive a text or a Snapchat or some type of notification. You don't know when it's going to happen, but it reinforces just staring at your phone, keeping tabs on your phone, knowing where your phone is. Because at some point in time, just randomly out of the blue, that you have no control over, you don't know if it's going to take 5 seconds, 5 minutes, or 5 hours to get the message. You will eventually receive a text message. This is one of the major reasons why people constantly check their phone. The variable interval schedule of reinforcement that they've been living under since the moment they got their phone is the schedule of reinforcement that is motivating them every day to just constantly check their phone. This is why focusing in class for an hour can be very challenging for some people, because who knows? It's been 5 minutes since I've checked my phone. I could have a text. I could have a Snapchat. I could have an email. There are a variety of notifications that your phone receives, all of which are great examples of variable interval. You don't know how long you have to sit there waiting. You have no idea how long you have to sit there on your phone, but you know eventually you'll receive an award. That random nature of receiving text messages makes it so that people constantly check their phone. As we'll talk about in just a moment when we compare this with the second side of today's concept map, variable schedules of reinforcement, where there's that random nature to it, are incredibly effective. So those are two that are based on increments of time. 1 week before your paycheck, 2 weeks before your paycheck, 7 days, very definitive. Or just, I have no idea how many seconds or minutes or hours need to pass before my phone goes off, but I know it will eventually happen. There's also schedules of reinforcement, though, based on what's called a ratio. So the 3 boxes to the right is the conclusion of today's concept map. Ratio schedules of reinforcement are based on the number of times a specific behavior has to be done. So it's not based on time. You don't just sit there and look at the clock. You actually have to do something, whether that's press a button, pull a lever, read a page. There are a variety of examples that will be classified under ratio. And the key here is we're no longer going to look at a clock or look at a calendar to worry about when the reinforcement is going to be provided. We are instead going to keep track of very specific behaviors. For example, fixed ratio is when you receive reinforcement after you do a set in stone number of behaviors. Again, the word fixed in Skinner terminology means does not change, same as fixed interval. Ratio in Skinner terminology means the number of times a behavior is done. When we combine that and do fixed ratio, I'm talking about things such as receiving a free beverage every 4th visit. You know that at the 4th visit to, let's say, Starbucks, you're going to receive a free drink. The amount of times that you go to Starbucks is not an increment of time that you look at a clock and measure. It's an actual behavior that you have to do. You have to physically go to the store, walk in the store and buy something. You actually have to do a specific behavior. It has nothing to do with minutes or seconds or weeks, months. So it's not an interval. Let's say, for example, you've maybe in elementary school had a teacher that said do 10 assignments, and at the 10th assignment, you'll get a sticker. That's another example of a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement. You know the exact number of times you have to do a very specific behavior before you receive a reward. Maybe you've studied like this or read a book like this where you say, okay, I have to read 10 pages, then I'll check my phone. That way you get through the 10 pages and then you receive the reinforcement, the reward for doing those 10 pages of reading. The underlying issue here with fixed ratio is it can sometimes be difficult to start back at the beginning. Like, for example, if you were going to try that, let me read 10 pages and then reward myself, that might work really well to get you to read those 10. But starting back at scratch at page 11 might be really challenging because in the back of your mind, you're like, oh, I have to do another 10 pages before a reinforcement. So there are some benefits to this, though there are some examples where this might not necessarily continue a behavior for a prolonged period of time. It is great, though, with things like Starbucks. I go to Starbucks and other coffee places quite frequently, so these reward systems are really beneficial to me because it's rewarding me for a behavior that I'd probably otherwise do. The last one, though, one's probably the most important of them all. It's the final box all the way on the right, and there's a little bit of text below the definition, so it doesn't follow the pattern of the previous 4, but it's what we call variable ratio. This one is by far the most effective of any of the schedules of reinforcement that we're talking about. Following the pattern, variable means changes. Ratio means it's a very specific behavior that you have to do. When we combine that together, variable ratio is a schedule of reinforcement based on a random number of specific behaviors. So you, the organism, living under a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement, you have no idea how many times you have to do something before you get the reinforcement. The most classic example of this are jackpots, let's say slot machines. Technically, sitting in front of a slot machine, the next time you play could be the jackpot. You could win, let's say, $1 million the next time you play. Or it could take 1,500 more slot plays before the next jackpot is won. Maybe it'll take 15. Sitting in front of a slot machine, you don't know. It's completely random. You have no idea how many times you need to put, let's say, $1 into the machine and pull the lever. So what typically happens? Well, people will sit in front of slot machines hours past their typical bedtime into the early morning hours. Why? Because there's always that chance that the next play is going to be the winner. This is very unlike previous types of schedules of reinforcement. Like, for example, when we talk about fixed ratio, reading 10 pages, rewarding yourself, reading 10 pages, rewarding yourself, you know on page 11 how far away the next reward is. And you can determine in that setting, am I really motivated to get through those 10 pages to receive my next reinforcement or my next reward? You actually know when the next reinforcement is coming. Variable ratio is the total opposite. You have no idea how many times it's going to take sitting in front of that machine, pulling down that lever before the reinforcement is provided. So out of all of the schedules of reinforcement, variable ratio is by far the most effective. And if you look at game design, whether it's apps, computer games, video games, casino games, just apps in general, variable ratio schedules of reinforcement will typically latch someone onto a behavior and make them just continue that behavior almost to a never-ending degree. That randomization and chance makes it so that the behavior that is being taught is resistant to what we call extinction. We'll define extinction in a later concept map, but it sort of is what it sounds like. It's when a behavior stops. It's when a behavior goes extinct. Well, variable ratio, this bottom right corner, final schedule of reinforcement, is the most resistant out of any of them to extinction. Behaviors that are reinforced in this random nature will make people persistently do a target behavior. Pull a lever of a slot machine. Let's say, for example, you're training your animal to press a button. And you say, you know what, just keep pressing that button. I'll randomly give you a treat after you press the button. Well, if you have a dog or a cat or an animal that knows eventually I'll get rewarded for pressing this button, they might sit there and just press it again and again. That random nature of rewards or reinforcement systems have been shown to reinforce the behavior, but make that behavior continue